Your starting salary as an MBA heavily depends upon what industry you choose and what school you choose. For an in-state top 50 kind of school, you might be making $100,000 a year with some sort of small 10 to 20K bonus. If you go to a top 10 or even a top 5 program, your salary could still range hugely depending upon whether or not you go into a traditional MBA top 5 school job like consulting at a McKinsey or investment banking at Goldman Sachs versus going into, say, the real estate sector or the startup world where starting salaries are significantly lower because you take more equity compensation. So that question of what will your starting salary be as an MBA heavily depends upon what area you're interested in. So if you know what industry you want to be in after graduation, then you can take your school's employment report and ask for their 25th percentile and their 75th percentile and their median for that job, and then you can see what the expected outcome could be. So for starting salaries, unfortunately, in most MBA programs, fewer and fewer graduates are owing less than what they earn in their first year out. Most people are taking on significant debt, especially for full-time programs where you lose those 2 years of earnings and you take on 2 years of debt, and it becomes a rather expensive proposition, and it makes that ROI last a long time. So here's a little bit of the analysis that I did at a more granular level of a starting salary for an MBA.
A couple notes about starting salaries. So according to the U.S. News and World Report breakdown of MBA salary by industry. So this is just salary. This doesn't necessarily include all compensation. But you can see that consulting, financial services, your typical traditional industries that hire MBAs are still paying MBAs a lot. And technology has risen in that field as well. And this is just typical across the board. The problem is MBAs are very specific to the one that you actually go to. So for example, if we look at Wharton, one of the top MBA programs in the country, you can see that median annual salaries are, in the low six-figure range with the sign-on bonus for most people. So you're probably in the mid to high 100,000 something level for going into an MBA program. How does that compare to the cost? So to get that starting MBA salary of 150 to 175,000 at a top school, then you're going to have to be borrowing about 115,000 per year times 2 plus accrued interest plus origination fees. You're probably looking at $250,000 by the time you graduate for a 150 to 175,000 per year career. If you look at a state program like University of Florida, then you can see that the median base salary it's about 105,000 with a signing bonus of about 20,000. So 125,000, salary for potentially a $60,000 to $80,000, costs. Clearly some of these in-state programs might have a better ROI, even though you might not have access to those top jobs. So an MBA's starting salary is highly dependent upon what program that you go to. And if you're going to go, I recommend going to a place where you're going to borrow less than 1 times your starting salary, unless you have aspirations to become a CEO of a major corporation or work in private equity or hedge funds or something like that, in which case, sure, go to the top programs. But that return on those top programs is not necessarily as good as it has always been. One way that people don't think about starting MBA salaries enough is they don't think about the opportunity cost for 2 years of lost wages on top of the negative cost of actually borrowing to go to an MBA program. So for example, if you look at these years, the first 2 years you're making nothing as an MBA. Now technically you could say, okay, well I'm going to make an intern salary when I'm in between school. But, just to make the math simple, this is what I'm presuming that it looks like, okay? I'm assuming that as an undergrad, you would make $60,000 and get decent raises, similar raises as an MBA, and you're going to start off at $150,000 as an MBA instead of $60,000 as a undergrad. Now, the issue is let's assume that you borrow $100,000 in each of those 2 years, which is really pretty accurate if you look at a lot of the top MBA programs. And certainly $150,000 for salary is what you're going to get coming out of a lot of the top 10, top 20 type MBA programs if you go the traditional consulting or investment banking kind of job route after school. And I'm assuming that both folks save 30%. Now, you could make an argument that the person that's got the $150,000 of salary could afford to have the same lifestyle and then also save more money. I'm just showing you this example because also the person with the MBA would pay more in taxes. They would probably live in a more high cost of living city, so they'd have to, pay more in rent. You could say, well, this is not adjusting for quality of life because maybe you want to be in a big fancy city where that, higher income helps you live there, whereas you might not be able to as an undergrad. But there's so many things that you could really kind of compare here. It's better just to go ahead and, put some parameters in place so you can make an actual comparison. So if we look at the net worth for the MBA, they graduate with negative 200,000, and then I'm assuming 30% of the MBA salary is going towards their net worth, and for net worth for the undergrad, it's 30% of their salary is going into investments and savings. So we'll assume that, this person is paying down their student loans or increasing their investments or both, and their positive net worth by 2025. So that's about, looks like 5 years after graduation. Now, in contrast for the undergrad, you already are almost at 200,000 of net worth by 2025. And then if you continue to extrapolate this out, you'll see that the first time that the MBA person surpasses the undergrad is in 2031, which looks like 12 years after the MBA started their program. So a 12-year break even is certainly pretty long, and that's assuming that the MBA could get access to salaries that this undergrad could never get access to, which in my experience is not really the case. What matters more is your motivation in a lot of cases. Now, this is not true, of course, for traditional industries like consulting or investment banking or something. You really might need to get an MBA to get to the top levels of those professions. And this is also not accounting for the exponential nature of salaries for MBAs. If you're able to get a job as a senior corporate executive or something like that, then, that would potentially be very valuable to get that MBA because the payoff could be exponential and not just, sort of a stable linear thing. But the exponential payoff is also somewhat limited to the top people in these programs. So you can't go into a top MBA program expecting you're going to be a CEO because that just doesn't necessarily happen for most people. So, looking at this, the question is a 12-year break even worth it? If you're going to have a 30 or 40-year career, absolutely. It's totally worth it. But the break-evens for getting an MBA are not nearly as good as they have been in the past because you're looking at a debt-to-income ratio over 1, and a lot of experts will typically tell you that you should only be doing a graduate degree if your debt is going to be below what you're earning in your first year out, and that's not really the case for almost any of the MBA programs now. For many of them at least, where you're borrowing to cover the full cost. So just like all of higher education, the returns have gotten very high, but the cost has gotten, almost as high, if not higher even. So the break even being like 12 years in this simple example just shows you that a starting salary for an MBA, you really need it to be some sort of six-figure number, and you need to be planning on some sort of very long career to justify not just continuing on in your career and not getting a master's of business administration.